есть город, который я вижу во сне. О, если бы знали, как дорог у Черного моря открывшийся мне в цветущих акациях город, в цветущих акациях город у Черного моря.
Chinese Cultural Revolution, as probably you know, took place in the last 10 years of Mao Zedong's rule on life between 1966 and 1976. But actually, the really revolutionary time in those 10 years were the first 2 years between 1966 and 68. So I shall concentrate on that short but very interesting, very significant period. Superficially, if you look at the images, for example, that we keep on those years, it appears to be a period of extreme gender uniformity. Women had to adopt men's clothes, generally speaking, but especially if they wanted to participate in political life, as many young women did. I shall turn back to that in a moment. They had to behave like men. They had to cut their hairs short, discard any makeup, and wear more or less military clothes, not only men's clothes, but military clothes. Men, actually, couldn't themselves behave so much like traditional men, because they had to reserve all their expression of love and affection to the supreme leader, Mao Zedong, and to the Communist Party, to the people's government, as long as they had been purified for their so-called bad or revisionist elements. So in a way, women became like men, but men became like the collective wife of the supreme leader. Only one man could be really virile. And we know that even as he was in his 70s, Mao Zedong was very womanizing. He reserved for himself the right to have a lot of sex affairs, something that was severely punished for the others. So it shows something about what was the Chinese society at that time. So in a way, it was the most degendered and desexualized society in history, maybe at the exception of the Khmer Rouge Cambodia that went in that aspect, as in many others, that was even more radical than communist China. Sexuality in marriage was considered a loss of revolutionary energy and time. On outside marriage, it became a crime. And you were exposed, it was not necessarily always the case, but you were exposed to being sent for some years in the concentration camps in the Laogai just for extramarital sex. Homosexuality, something that was never heard by most young people at that time, they didn't even know that it could exist. There are many strangely testimonies about that, was even more harshly punished, sometimes, not necessarily, but sometimes it incurred death penalty when it was discovered. Even published work, in a very Orwellian way, were purified of any expression of love. For example, one of the most famous works of the Cultural Revolution period, the White Hair Girl, that gave especially birth to one of the so-called revolutionary operas of the time, was at first written in 1958, and the two revolutionary heroes were in love with each other. But after 1966, no, they were not in love anymore. They were just comrades in arms. And so no expression of affection outside the party and its leaders were tolerated. However, until now, I think I said very obvious things for anybody who knows a little bit about communist China. The interesting point is that the actual place of women in the Cultural Revolution is difficult to appreciate, even as it appears very simple. On the one hand, in political mobilizations, they played a very active role. They were not infrequently Red Guards leaders. And of course, for China, where extreme male superiority was a completely admitted Confucian concept, it was something very new. The traditional values of seniority and masculine superiority were turned upside down. Young people, among them many young females, became leaders at 15, 16, 17 years old and played an important role, at least for some years. So, of course, that played very heavily in the appeal of revolution for young people. They were no more submissive with their parents, no more submissive with their seniors, no more submissive with their teachers, their principals, party cadres, and so on. They struggled, what they called struggled, and more than often tortured and led to suicide many of their elders, their seniors. You shouldn't, even if women were very prominent in this movement, you shouldn't think that any kind of feminist values were active among them. Women were even more viciously attacked than men by boys and girls, with many allusions to their supposed vanity in appearance, deviant sexuality. Women were called whores, for example, no equivalent for men. And there were it plays an important role, especially in the persecution of some of the few female leaders, like the wife of the President of the Republic, Liu Shaoqi. Wang Guangmei had to excuse for having been flirtatious, I quote, with Indonesian President Sukarno on some pictures of her journey, official visit to Indonesia a few years before. And she had to wear in front of a huge crowd, hostile crowd, of course, in a ridiculous way, the very clothes she had worn at that time, especially a very unacceptable Western-style dress that she had as official clothes. And she had to wear it, but in a very ugly way, and with and she had to also endure the appellation of old shoe, that means prostitute in Chinese colloquial. Just an example, but there are many others. Actually, when female Red Guards fell from grace, and it happened very fast. After 1968, the movement was almost finished, and the Red Guards became accused of being against Mao Zedong, against the revolution. They were corralled back, if I could say, in their femininity, in their traditional female role, and they were themselves accused of vanity, of improper sex behavior, and so on. It was very harsh. For example, even women who had simply adopted children because they were infertile were considered as deviant women. It was something that was not considered acceptable. The young women also suffered from discriminatory violences. For example, when they were captured by their adversaries, because very soon the Red Guard groups started fighting against each other for power, and very harshly fighting with a lot of death. But the girls, when they were captured by the others, by the Red Guards, they were very badly slapped, almost to death sometimes. That's something that didn't happen to their male companions, male comrades. They could, of course, be killed, but in other ways. And, of course, as you could guess, they also suffered a lot of rapes. On especially, it was considered very normal for Red Guards or for soldiers fighting the Red Guards to rape their female prisoners. It was almost normal it was a way to humiliate them and to reduce to nothing the appeal and the low superiority of the group in which they were part. Actually, another limitation, two other limitations in that power. First, there are many testimonies showing that very traditionally, the practical tasks in these groups were almost completely taken over by females. Both sexes made revolution, but the one, of course, as you could guess, the ones curing the injured male fighters, the one preparing food for them, cleaning their clothes, were almost always girls, not men. Another limitation, of course, was the submission to the supreme leaders around Mao Zedong. I already talked about Mao Zedong. There was only one female leader, his own wife, and we know that it was actually a trade-off for at a time when his wife Jiang Qing was even excluded from his private apartments. Mao Zedong actually lived with not one but several other women, and as a compensation, he gave a huge political role to Jiang Qing, but as appeared after Mao's death, Jiang Qing didn't survive more than 1 month politically. And so it was an exception that confirms the rule that actually it was a completely male-led revolution. Nevertheless, and I want to, my last point to become even more complex, some recent researchers, literary works, films, and so on, do show yet another more complicated picture. The official discourse was extremely puritanical. On the slightest, as I said, the slightest expression of sexuality or even platonic love could lead to the harshest sanctions. Of course, the girls being more victims than the boys and the males, if only because the girls could become pregnant. It happened quite sometimes, and the father could sometimes, not always, escape sanctions, but not the girls. And they were at the minimum chased far from all their position, political or work position. They were forcibly separated from the culprit boy if he was discovered. They were struggled against. They had to endure long meetings of accusations, slander. They were also, they became the last, if they, for example, if there were city girls sent to the countryside after 1968, it was something very common. 13 million young people were sent to the countryside. They became the last on the list to be able to come back to their native city. So they had to stay some more years than the other ones. Bon. Everybody, so that led in many occurrences to suicide, to girl suicide, to girl infanticide. If they succeeded hiding their pregnancy, very often they killed or they abandoned their child, not to be punished. And there were, everybody at that time knew of couples of that kind committed double suicide, committing suicide together. At the same time, the freedom at an early age of these people from these girls from parental or school control, on their extended travels throughout China, at least for 2 years, between 66 and 68, allowed a lot of romantic or even sexual adventures to happen. Actually, if you were more or less discreet, if you didn't show openly outside, you could do a lot of things in that period. There are so many testimonies of that. And it was something that was almost impossible before 1966. So the girls who could travel between the many dangers, they could remember of that period as a very exhilarating one, a period of lot of love and even sex freedom, relatively free, of course, as I expressed. From the early 70s, especially as there were so many girls, especially the girls sent to the countryside, were raped, and very often raped by local party leaders, who sometimes behaved like small local emperors, led to much freer discussion of these issues that were before almost completely hidden. Even in the official press, there were a lot of condemnation of these rapes and new measures taken to protect better the girls. So the atmosphere changed a little bit, even if it was due to the terrible fate of thousands of these girls. There are also other indications that girls could remain in the interstices of the system, could remain fairly free. For example, there are description in the everybody, the young people, especially when they were moving, they stayed in dormitories. Of course, separated dormitories according to the gender. But the male dormitories were terribly stinking, dirty, messy, full of fleas. The girls' dormitories were much better arranged, much cleaner, much better kept. And even the girls, for example, normally in public they had no makeup, nothing that could consider vain. But in their dormitories, they used many creams on powders, on beauty lotions. Many of them that they had stolen actually, or in shops, or in because they could inspect shops and even private houses. So in shops, and even more maybe in private houses, many of them had stolen some of these creams that they used between themselves, outside the sight of the boys, because the boys were very puritanistic. They are their own comrades. If they knew that, they would have accused them, asked them to repent from that crime. They had, in private houses or in libraries, they also stole, of course, 2 minutes. They also stole a lot of books. And among these books, some romantic or even sometimes erotic books. And there are many descriptions of the Red Guards in the evening reading avidly or even during all night these books and making copies. Of course, no photocopies at that time, so they made handwritten copies. Like samizdat, you know that? Soviet Union, handwritten copies of these very exciting books read by both girls and boys. And we have kept even some books that were written by Red Guards, also hand-copied. And interestingly, some written by girls. For example, insisting that they should access to political power and to party high position, because when they were in that power, when in that position, they could accumulate a lot of male lovers, and male would become very submissive to all their desires. So last point is that I would emphasize that some of the city values of more equal relationship between men and women were brought to the countryside by those 13 million young rusticated people, And at a time when in the villages, women were still, during marriage, sold by the weight. Huh? The money you had to give to the parents of the girls were according to the weight of the girl, because what was sold was the ability to labor on nothing else. So with the city girls, things changed a little bit. Not that much, because actually there were very few marriage between, for example, city girls on farmer boys, if only because at that time, even until recently in China, it has been abolished only a few years ago. When you were living in a village, you had no right to come to a city. So if somebody from the city married a boy, she had to, for example, a girl sent to a village wanted to marry a boy on the spot, she had to live all her life in the village. And of course, she didn't want. So it led again to many child abandons, for example, for the girls to be able to come back to the city. At the reverse, yes, I really finished. At the reverse, it's true that the farmers, the peasants, were much less puritanistic than the city dwellers in their expression of love, sexuality. They made very many bad jokes on the youngsters from the cities were horrified by the open sex discussion in villages about among the villagers. By the fact also that, especially in summer, people wore almost no clothes, and it was something terrible. And it brings some reflections, of course, to these city dwellers. I just finished by saying that when they came back to the cities, of course, not everything was good. On many of this, it was, if I could say, another expression of female agency, but many girls coming back to the cities became prostitutes, usually prostitutes apparently without any proxenetes, without pimps. Huh? But of course, because they were forced to do that by their terrible situation, no work, no position in school, in universities, often separation from the parents and so on. And there were also gangs of male former Red Guards, often chasing girls, a lot of insecurity in cities. So it's another way to appreciate this very complex image of female position during the Cultural Revolution. I would just say one last sentence, that despite the difficulties and extreme sufferings for millions of people, and especially for women, the Cultural Revolution experience has not been as wholly negative for the liberation of Chinese women and individuals as is usually assumed. Even if, of course, I hope you have understood me, I don't want in any way say that it was a good period that we should have nostalgia for. Thank you.